I'm Scott Sagan, the co-director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and it's a real pleasure to welcome back Dr. Erica Gaston to CSAC. Erica is the head of the Conflict Prevention Program at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research, and she's an adjunct professor at Columbia School for International and Public Affairs. The most recent book, which she will be talking off of today, Illusions of Control, has recently been shortlisted for the Conflict Research Society's Book of the Year prize in 2025. She also edited a book on ethics in 21st century military conflict and edited a book on laws of armed conflict in 21st century conflicts. We are welcoming her back because in addition to her PhD from Cambridge and her law degree from Harvard Law School, she's a graduate of Stanford University and of the 2003 CSAC Honors Program. We'll be following our normal procedures. After Erica's talk, I'm going to give the fellows the first questions or first few questions, and I'd like everybody, then we'll open it up to the room, and I'll be reading some questions from the online audience. And if everyone could please identify yourself and just give a 1 or 2 sentence description of what you research, what you are researching this year, to give Erica and the online audience a sense of who's in the audience and the nature of your question. So without further ado, let me turn it over. Please welcome Dr. Erica Gaston.
Thank you, Scott. It's great to be back here after more than 20 years and to see some familiar places. I'm having flashbacks from my senior year, presentation and delivering on that. Yeah, as Scott introduced, my day job is a little bit different now. I work for a UN think tank, so I work on a range of issues related to everything from institutional reforms at the UN to peacekeeping and peace building challenges to climate, peace, and security. But the work I'm going to present on today is focused on my book, which came out of my PhD research, and it stems from my time in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. I should say that I started this book, or I started the research for this book shortly after law school. So much against the advice of my mentors and advisors like Scott, who told me valiantly not to go to law school, I nonetheless went to Harvard Law. I think it's because he thought that I would go afterwards into working for a law firm, not that I would immediately go from law school into working from Afghanistan. But that is where I ended up. And that is where the start of this book and this research story begins. So in 2008 and 2009, let me see, I can't quite get the clicker to work. I might have to just move up there. No problem. So starting in 2008, 2009, I was working in Afghanistan at the time, looking at IHL violations, working with a couple of human rights NGOs. And it was the moment and time, it was sort of the height of the counterinsurgency surge in Afghanistan. So it was premised not only on having this surge of US forces come in to turn around the situation from the Taliban at the time, but also trying to empower a sort of counterinsurgency bottom-up movement. One of the ways that they planned to do that was to support tribal militias and other community defense forces to really be that sort of ground force and bottom-up part of winning hearts and minds and flipping communities back from siding with the Taliban to siding with the Afghan government that was supported by US forces. So at the time, they were mobilizing all of these different pilot initiatives, different militias across the region. But they also, in addition to mobilizing these militias, had started to embed these programs, all of which would evolve into the Afghan local police, which I'll talk about later, with all of these different checks and controls. So they would not only have, they would have communities that would weigh in on, whether someone was a good character, whether they should be the right person, be in charge of oversight and monitoring later. They later embedded parts of it within the Afghan government, and they had all of these institutional controls. Special operations forces also were supposed to be really involved in site selection and then embedding and mentoring these forces for some time. And in addition to all of the regular training that they might get on sort of like operational tactics or counterinsurgency, they would also have some background checks related to whether they had perpetrated abuses, whether they were linked to warlords, whether they had engaged in misconduct or engaged in narcotic smuggling or things like that. And so it was almost as if, they were saying, okay, we recognize that there's been issues with militia mobilization in the past in Afghanistan. That's an understatement. But this time, we're going to do it better. We've got the right key to it. We're going to embed all of these different checks and controls. You could say this was just a particular moment in Afghanistan. As I mentioned, the heart of the counterinsurgency, this idea of winning hearts and minds, obviously coming off of a background of a country where if there's one country that might teach you about the risks of militia mobilization, it's Afghanistan. So you could say it was this particular country and moment. But I then switched to working in Iraq and Syria and the period of time after ISIL took over large parts of Iraq and expanded its control in Syria. And what I started to see there, one, there was a similar U.S. effort to mobilize these local forces, both in Iraq, a sort of 30 to 60,000 strong sort of also community defense forces, not too dissimilar from those in Afghanistan. But there were also an expansion in U.S. support to Syria armed groups, which had been ongoing, but sort of took on greater momentum at this time. And in both of these cases, even though this is a very different context, very different environment from Afghanistan, and flash over to Syria, you're talking about opposition rebel forces, so very different model from the sort of pro-government counterinsurgency forces you would be talking about in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. So very different forces, but across all of these different ones, also saw a lot of the same tactics. So saw some of these same requirements for human rights training and vetting, for different types of institutional monitoring and oversight or reporting functions. In Syria, some of them were quite elaborate. So even though there was no access to ground control, they created these new databases to do human rights vetting that were modeled after the databases that exist in the State Department for regular security assistance. It's known as the Leahy Law. They not only did first rounds of them, but they would do double and triple vetting. There were also similar types of vetting and background checks for the CIA covert support, including on some conduct-based issues. There were elaborate weapons control protocols, payroll processes. So for the FSA, the Free Syrian Army support they received from the CIA, if they wanted to receive more TOW missiles, so anti-aircraft missiles, they had to collect and bring back the spent missile casings in order to get more. They also do video reporting and additional training in order to get it. And then across all these different programs, there were also red lines, codes of conduct, and many of them were cut whenever they transgressed them. So a pretty elaborate menu of controls for the type of environments that we're talking about. So my question coming into this was, what explains all of these different checks and controls? Do they work? What are the consequences? So I started looking around. I will say, by the way, I do not intend that as an academic puzzle. I'm having flashbacks to my time as a CSAC honor student, Scott, being like, that's not an academic puzzle. No, it was not. I was working as a practitioner at the time. But I did start looking into this, and I was curious if there were any theoretical models that explain why all of these different checks and controls manifested. And there was actually a pretty strong framework for it. So a lot of people, maybe some of you included, who look into some of these proxy warfare delegations, a lot of them look to principal agent theory as a framework for understanding these relationships. So they analogize this relationship, let's say, between the U.S. and a militia force to a contract, where if you outsource some of the labor to this militia force, it allows for a division of labor, specialization for this armed group, also a way to outsource the costs and risks. But there are limits and there are cons to doing this sort of outsourcing and delegation. And that is that you could get the wrong type of agent. Instead of getting a like-minded agent, one who has very different interests, one who wants to simply shirk behavior and not do a lot, or does things that are completely counter to the patron's interests. And so the remedy for that within principal agent theory is to establish control mechanisms. So selection mechanisms to allow you to select the best agent, or at least be aware of their deficits. Establish rules and standard, monitor and create oversight mechanisms so you can appraise when those standards are break down. Different incentives and sanctions to keep them to those rules and standards, as well as checks and balances. There's also a sort of overall thought that, going into whether you establish these controls or not, the patrons are going to think about some of the costs and the benefits of them. So whenever you impose all these costs, let's say you set up a monitoring and oversight framework, that takes time, that takes resources, it takes access, maybe more costly than it would be to just do the work yourself. It also may not be feasible in all circumstances. So if you're talking about an area where you're delegating to the agent because they have specialization, because you don't have access or don't want to exert the manpower, then these may be situations where, imposing control mechanisms either won't work or is going to be more costly than the delegation itself. There also can be situations where the principal may simply accept slack because they have no other options or they can't do the controls effectively. And there's a lot of literature on when these are not going to be effective, particularly when there's multiple competing patrons and a complex patron, which is exactly what the U.S. bureaucracy is, as you can imagine. So that's the sort of framework. So what I tried to do first was look, okay, how are these lining up with the sort of scenarios that we're talking about with these sort of militia delegations? And the first kind of expectation we'd have from principal agent theory is that states will delegate where there's cost savings and advantages to doing so. And that's all over the literature on these forces, 100%. So these sort of local forces or militias are framed as warfare on the cheap. They are the local conflict experts. They're the expert in their particular local area. And they're a way to save deploying more US troops, or in some cases, unfortunately, to outsource the dirty work. So there's a lot of reasons that you would see that delegation happening. Check. Also, however, there's a risk of high adverse selection where there's a limited selection pool and where there's a high information asymmetry. And that as well is something that you see replete across these different areas. So let's say you want to find the one guy who can mobilize a force in a small Afghan village and is interested in fighting the Taliban. You might have a selection pool of one commander. You don't have a lot of choices. So instead of getting a like-minded agent, you might just get a good enough agent for that, all over the place. Another kind of assumption we would have, as I mentioned, is that principals will try to address slack through control mechanisms, but that we would expect these control mechanisms to be more costly or more difficult to impose, less effective, where there is a limited selection pool, where we have limited observability, and also where you have some of these other factors like competing patrons. And you see this in the extreme in all of these environments. So take an environment like Syria, where there's not access directly to the ground, high fluctuation in terms of the conflict environment, really impossible levels of information asymmetry, and very little way to actually monitor them, as well as some of the other complicating factors I talked about, competing patrons, abound in all of these things. So in those scenarios, you might expect, okay, the assumption is that where control mechanisms are going to be costly, ineffective, or counterproductive, the patron is not going to impose them. That's what the theory tells us. But what we see, and what I gave a little bit of a preview to just in those examples, is that that is not actually what happened. That again and again, even when imposing these control mechanisms proved extremely costly, even to the extent of undermining some of the purpose of the delegation, that they continued to be imposed and that they stayed in place and over a successive period of time. And so this was really what led me to ask the puzzle, why does this last piece not add up? Are there alternate theoretical frameworks that would help us understand why these different control mechanisms emerged and what that tells us about the role that they're playing in these situations? The other parallel theoretical framework that I look at stems from foreign policy analysis, and that's the bureaucratic politics approach. And its overall framework is that we're not thinking, and when we think about understanding these decision-making moments, it's not a simple, cost-benefit analysis or rational analysis, that this results from all of these different psychosocial inputs in the milieu. It can result from bargaining or decision-making. And bureaucratic politics approach particularly looks at decision-making as the result of different bargaining or competing interests from the range of stakeholders that are involved. The famous quip from Graham Allison, who really is the father of this line of work, is that where you stand depends on where you sit. And from analyzing things like the Cuban Missile Crisis to other US kind of key presidential decision-making moments, looks at the way that other players' positions and their bargaining was really what resulted in the ultimate outcomes. There's also another strain within bureaucratic politics approach that looks at organizational approaches and kind of holds that in addition, these organizational lenses, mission sets, frameworks, so how the DoD thinks about approaching a problem, how the State Department might think about understanding of foreign policy dynamics, that this really cues up the different foreign policy options and can be determinative of the outcome. So I looked primarily at these two approaches, and the reason I looked for them, as you might have gotten a sense from the intro as well, is that not only are these programs the result of complex bureaucratic decision-making, often leading up to the high-level decision-making around the president, but that there's also lots of other stakeholders involved. You know, there's the NGOs and UN folks who are raising issues about these groups in the media. There are, other foreign stakeholders like the Afghan or Iraqi government. There's the groups themselves who may be weighing in. So thinking about how these different stakeholders might have been trying to influence these positions and also the control mechanisms is one of the advantages that this has. A disadvantage, at least theoretically, is that so far a lot of BPA has not been applied outside of, frankly, looking at a lot of executive decision making. So not applied very often to foreign stakeholders or NGOs or non-state armed groups. And then it doesn't have sort of a theory of change over time. So these are, I'm mentioning those because I'll bring them up later in the talk. Okay, so briefly on the countries and groups, and then I'll get into some of the case studies. So as I said in the introduction, I looked at Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, had 12 case studies of varying levels of granularity on each of them. In terms of the types of group we're talking about, so as you might get a sense from the opener, we've got everything ranging from pro-government militias, what are sometimes called paramilitary, parastatal, or auxiliary forces, to rebels or opposition groups. There's a range of nomenclatures that you could apply to each of them. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of who my different case study groups are. And I promise you, I had a lot of fights with my PhD supervisor about that and whether we could compare all of these. But I think the fundamental thing here is that what I was looking at was not necessarily trying to establish a typology of whether X group is easier to control than that Y group, or which one is more likely to result in control mechanisms. But fundamentally, the primary actor I'm looking at here is U.S. decision-making. And how does it respond to different demands for risk mitigation with a range of different sub-state armed groups? Another question would be that I get a lot is why focus on non-state armed groups? You obviously have some of the same risk mitigation concerns about human rights abuses, weapons transfer, security threats, all of that with regular state actors. One is just that, it came out of my original interest of thinking about how do you control these armed groups and how it is sort of a novel question. But also, like a lot of the responses in terms of state security assistance are already well embedded within US bureaucracy and protocols. So they make it a less fertile area to study and see how they change and respond over time. And then the last, just on this selection, some of these forces are completely non-state actors. Some are later brought in and sort of co-opted into the Iraqi or Afghan government. So they sort of become quasi-state or state actors. They still remain sort of militias when their overall function. And so I still keep them in the sample set. Also, since a lot of what I'm looking at is how do you control these actors? And one of the ways to do it is to bring them into the institutional milieu. If I sort of drop them out at that point, I lose a lot of the test point for my study. Okay, so now getting into some of these examples, because I do want to be mindful of time. I start out comparing the initial Afghan local police project that I talked about with the Sons of Iraq that started prior to that. And really the ALP started just a few years after the Sons of Iraq or the Sahwa program, and really was inspired by it. A lot of the same generals and military advisors who came over to Afghanistan from being deployed in Iraq had seen this program that they thought was wildly successful at flipping communities and thought, okay, we need to do the same thing for Afghanistan. And so they're close in time to each other, really similar model, and a lot of the same advisors working in it. But what they were quite different on was the amount of control mechanisms they had. So the Sons of Iraq was very light. I mean, talk to people who were involved in it, and the amount of selections, it was a walk-in affair. It was, are you interested in fighting against AQI? Come and join this. So really very minimal. There's some late stage registration and weapons rostering and a debate with the Maliki government over Iraqi government oversight. It's very light. Versus, as I mentioned, from Afghan local police, almost from the onset, it's just embedded with these layers of different controls and mechanisms. And so trying to look at what was the difference between these. You could think about your principal agent assumptions, for example, and think, oh, was it maybe that it was less costly to impose controls in Afghanistan? I mean, probably not. It's an even more kind of larger mountainous terrain with less forces that you had available in terms of observability, not any easier to impose controls. Your exigencies were really high in Iraq, but militias were also viewed as a linchpin in Afghanistan, and also similarly limited time horizon to see results. There was much more of a history of militia abuse or misuse in Afghanistan, so you could say there was more awareness of the costs at the time, for example. But the different interesting thing, you could compare Iraq and Afghanistan, or you could just compare Afghanistan with Afghanistan. So there had been, say, half a dozen different militia programs that preceded this one over the previous period of time. And in none of them did you have this sort of controls training emphasis on all of it. So why at this particular moment did you get this explosion of controls if the factors are relatively the same? And what I really look at, again, this is from the bureaucratic policy analysis, is that you had the emergence of a bargaining moment that in effect sort of disrupted what we would expect from the principal agent expectations. So in Afghanistan, they had been piloting these programs under General Stanley McChrystal. He thought they were pretty successful. He wanted to expand them across Afghanistan, but he needed, by his estimate, some $1.8 billion to support this. And he needed a lot of manpower in order to roll this out in all of these different communities, and also to have them supported by the Afghan government. When he needed those funds, the first thing he needed to get was Chief of Mission authorization from the U.S. ambassador at the time, who was Carl Eikenberry, himself a former commanding general who had a long history in Afghanistan. And his experience in Afghanistan told him that this was a really bad idea. And it was sort of the worst practice of what the U.S. had been doing in Afghanistan. And without some checks and controls, it wasn't likely to work. So he sort of drew a line in the sand. The debate leaks out into the public and becomes a much, much larger debate. And also ultimately because, Eikenberry says he's not going to go forward with it unless there's Afghan buy-in. The Karzai government is also sort of invited into the bargaining arena, and they have their own demands and pressure points. By contrast, if you look at Iraq at the same period of time, it sort of grows from the bottom. There's no top-down authorization that they're looking for. They've also got all the money and the manpower they need with U.S. forces and with SERP. So it just sort of takes off, and initially is actually hidden from Maliki at the time so that he won't object to it. And so by the time the force reaches 100,000, it's almost too late. Like the authorization moment has passed. There is later a point when they need the Iraqis to take over the program for it to be sustained as they're looking towards U.S. withdrawal. And this does sort of trigger a late stage bargaining moment. It's what Maliki uses to be able to insert some of his preferred controls, mostly having the Iraqi government in charge of payroll and things like that, so he can then fire all of them. But it only comes in the late stage. And again, you can see it's a bargaining. The other key difference between these, and it's a complex slide it's supposed to be, is they're just a really different bargaining environment. So like Iraq at the time, Petraeus wants to do something, Petraeus does something. He has the full backing of the U.S. ambassador, full backing of Bush at the time. He's got 150,000 U.S. forces on the ground who are able to do whatever he wants. Sometimes he lets U.S. allies talk to him about concerns they might have. Sometimes he talks to Maliki, but he's basically got all of the force that he needs. He doesn't need to get buy-in. Versus if you look at McChrystal and then later Petraeus, who takes over in their position as head of U.S. and ISAF command, they need to get the buy-in from the U.S. government. The U.S. Embassy Kabul not only has Eikenberry, but 5 U.S. ambassadors at the time, just to give you a sense of the complexity. He gets to get it from the different parts of the Afghan government, from the ISAF nations, at least the ones that they want to take part in the security nations. And then also it's a really fertile UN and NGO space that is able to has shown it's able to galvanize a lot of public attention towards certain issues. And each of these different actors, when news comes that the ALP is going to be authorized or they're planning to do it, they each have their own concerns. This is going to undo a decade of state building. This is going to undo all that we've put into DDR. It's going to empower warlords and enable war crimes and abuses. Afghan government, this is totally going to undermine our state control and our ability to be a sovereign country. So you name it, and they put out all of these different concerns. And for each one of them, the primary way that the Special Operations Forces who are leading this, and McChrystal and others at ISAF Command deal with it, is they say, don't worry about it. We have that undertaken. You're worried about war crimes, we will do the human rights training and vetting, we'll do the background checks. You're worried about counter narcotics being undermined by these sort of warlord connections, we're going to set a rule. No affiliation with warlords, no counter narcotics. Someone raised an issue about detention operations. Don't worry, we'll restrict them from doing those. So it's almost like each of these control mechanisms become a way to undermine the position of opponents or to bring them on side. So the number one thing they do, initially the SOF say, we don't want it to have any linkage with the Afghan ministries because they're corrupt, and that will counter our ability to win over communities. But this is the only way that you can get the Afghans on side, as well as Eikenberry and also some of the other ISAF nations. So they embed the program under the Ministry of Interior. Completely undermines, by the way, what they believe is necessary to actually control and address behavior issues with this group. So if you're thinking about controls as a way to address problems of the agent, this is no longer about that. It is just about winning people on side in order to get the program authorized. So if you go down the list, you can kind of line them up with each of these different groups. And as I mentioned, it really deviates from being a discussion anymore about how do you address the concerns about this to how do you get the program authorized. So that's a first example that we look at. I then look at a number of different cases in Syria. I'm not going to go through all of them because we don't have the time, don't worry. But what I want to highlight for Syria is, of course, it's a completely different environment. Plethora of risks here, war crimes on all sides, a number of hostile actors that the U.S. would be concerned about. So if you're putting weapons into it, that they'd be taken over and given to Al-Qaeda or taken over by Hezbollah or other groups that are operating in the country. Also, a lot of risks as they get into some of the later partnerships in terms of alliance costs. So when they start supporting Kurdish groups up in the north, it triggers real issues with Turkey, which we'll get into. And it's also an area where, notwithstanding all of these plethora of risks, there are a number of barriers to controls. So the way that principal agent theory thinks about it, it's not, okay, the more risks you have, the more controls you have. No, it's supposed to be a weighing of costs and benefits. So it's not simply to say like, okay, the Obama administration is worried about all these risks. It's natural we'd see these controls. But in fact, this is exactly the environment where we would least see them because there's no boots on the ground. There's no observability. There's hundreds of arms groups and flux. No way that we're going to see a lot of these be effective. And everyone going into these programs knew it. State Department officials, White House officials would just say there's no such thing as perfect vetting in that environment. It's not possible. And yet they go forward with them anyway. Also a complicated slide, which we will, don't worry, not get into all of it. But I just want to show you for each of these are just 5 of the cases I looked at. There's a lot of other armed group support. But for each of them, you had this extensive list of them ranging from, building a new Leahy-like database in the State Department support or double or triple vetting, lots of cutting off whenever red lines were crossed, to, which I'll get into shortly, kind of similar constraints following through in the CIA covert support and the DoD train and equip iterations. Focusing on the first one on the White House debate, this is interesting because in a way it's a little bit like the classic BPA, everyone's around the president, Cuban Missile Crisis, this is the Cuban Missile Crisis of the Obama administration. Do you arm Syrian rebels? And you see this initial part of the debate where Obama is really skeptical. He has the CIA commission this report for him on when does it work to arm and train rebels. And they're basically like, never, especially if you don't put boots on the ground, which he's not willing to do. And so he initially goes into this plan, which Petraeus and Clinton are 100% behind. They've come up with a plan of how to do this. And they say to responsibly vet and train and supply Syrian rebels. And he says this is just a bad idea. But they come to him and they say, no, look, we've got all of this evidence. We've already been doing this with some of the State Department non-lethal support. And we've done this in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have ways to control the weapons. We have ways to vet and follow up on war crimes and other misconduct. And the conversation, when you read accounts of it, it goes from this top level idea of like, is this a good idea, to, well, how would the weapons control be managed? Or in the first iteration of it, I'm not satisfied with what the vetting scrutiny is going to do. So Petraeus and Clinton, they go back and they retool the plan and they adjust all of the control mechanisms. They come back and they get authorization for it finally in April 2013. And it's not that they do it only because of the control mechanisms. That's not, the tipping point that, or sort of the ultimate thing that shifted Obama's concern. He also was looking around for something to do after after it had surfaced that chemical weapons had been used, getting a lot of pressure from regional allies. So he sort of goes along with it, but these become the sort of tipping point. They're the ways that where it brought enough people in the administration on board to support it and then allow this authorization to get through. So yet again, we see an example where control mechanisms at a certain point, it's less about will these actually control the agents, which most people thought they wouldn't, but how does this actually prevail in the bargaining debate and get this program authorized? The train and equip program, is the last kind of in-depth one I'll give you an example of, is sort of a snowballing of all of them. You might remember this. This was right after the ISIL threat emerged in 2014. And this is the first time that Congress gets in the game to officially authorize overt arming and training of Syrian rebels in it. And so it not only has to deal with all of the reservations the White House dealt with, now it's an overt program. So everything that DoD would think about in security assistance in an overt program, as well as all the other interagency input from State Department and other things. But it's also got congressional fears. And Congress, for them, this is the first time they've been asked to authorize, an entry of some use of force in the Middle East since the Iraq War, which they've been regretting since then. So they're really nervous about giving Obama a blank check to go into Syria. So they're concerned not just about weapons being taken by al-Nusra and surfacing that, on the public news page, or people being kidnapped or war crimes being enabled by a fund program that Congress has overtly funded. They're also worried about, okay, how do we impose limits on the administration so they can't use this to start into a larger conflict against Assad? And so what they do, in addition to, if you read the legislation, it's remarkable. They have like detailed vetting requirements written into the legislation on all of these things, but they also impose a restriction that fighters have to pledge only to fight ISIL and not fight Assad. And the pledge is actually, it's in the book, but it's also publicly available. It's amazing. It also reads as a sort of distilled version of IHL. If you read it, and the Syrian fighters had to kind of raise their hands and pledge to this. The program gets nowhere. I mean, it's so overloaded with all of these restrictions. They're supposed to get all of these fighters in Jordan, give them this elaborate training that one officer described as sort of the gold standard of IHL training for them, and then they'll redeploy. But there's so many different checks and restrictions on it, it can't even recruit enough fighters. They send a few of the ones that come in are so mercenary that they sort of decamp as soon as they get redeployed back into Syria. So less than a year into it, $250 million expended. General Lloyd Austin testifies, Congress is like, how many fighters do you think are actually fighting for us? And he's like, I think about 4 or 5. So it's like an abysmal failure. It ends very quickly. It isn't the end of Congress's funding of this initiative. They then take the train and equip funding and use it on, multiple other ones, 2 of which I profile. One is sort of the Northwest Syrian Arab groups that they look at. Another is later the Kurdish groups. This one, I'll just put a caveat on, it's super funny because now we realize we need somebody to help us get them into Syria. So we kind of work with Turkey, and Turkey's going to do it. But because of the U.S. restrictions, it really doesn't want any of these Islamic ideological groups. But that's exactly who Turkey wants, in addition to having some Turkish proxies. So basically, in addition to all of these other vetting requirements, you now have to find a fighter who is willing to fight ISIL, who both the Turkey and U.S. would like to support. One State Department official I talked to said it was analogized to searching for unicorns. And so this program also goes nowhere. They're finally left with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which despite the kernel of them being on the U.S. Designated terrorist lists and the arch enemy of Turkey, is sort of the least bad option. And it's the one they go forward with. And then, of course, we still have a partnership with today. There are additional controls related to that to try to appease Turkey, but for time, I won't get into them immediately. So why do we see all of these different controls? One, as I mentioned, is the bargaining moment that kind of opens up, but also particularly as you start to see some of the later programs, it's almost like you've seen all the time, you've had time to appraise all of the different costs that add up for all of these different programs, that these are really hamstrunging these programs, how they can operate, and that they're not really effective. Like no one actually thinks this is stopping war crimes in Syria. Maybe it's weeding out a few bad actors, but probably not even that, given the information asymmetries. So why instead do we see this? And this comes in the second part of the sort of organizational theory, because once these mechanisms that were created perhaps initially to win and prevail in some bureaucratic debate, like with the idea of doing Leahy-like vetting in the first State Department assistance, they then have this sticky quality. So once they've been, they've successfully gotten this program approved, and then they've gotten this program approved, they become this sort of default that every program afterwards, this is sort of the logic of appropriateness, that we will then apply human rights vetting and cutoffs in every one of these forces as they start to come up. Same thing starts to happen with the sort of ideological vetting and other sort of security forces, which get started as a way to show we're managing risk, and then later just become pro forma and sort of put on ad nauseum. You also see that increasingly with the training, codes of conducts and red lines that go from initially like a very light red line to, like I said, in some cases, a full law of land warfare training. Also with monitoring and reporting, and then sanctions and cutoffs where these are violated. So you start to see emerging, if not a firm SOP, at least a common approach to say, okay, this is what we're going to do with risk mitigation with these types of actors. And then I'll just note this quickly. I'm going to keep going a little bit more quickly just for time. I also looked at two later programs that were in Afghanistan and Iraq after the initial Sahwa and with the ALP, and these were the tribal mobilization forces in Iraq that started after the ISIL takeover of territory, and also a later territorial force under the ALP. And in both of them, you had two different types of organizational effects. You had sort of legacy effects, where basically they repurposed the same controls that had worked in getting the Sahwa and the ALP sort of authorized or sustained. So it sort of made it easier that they had these legacy effects. But then you also saw some pro forma application of these other things. So like with the TMF, it had written into the legislation almost the same things that were in the Syria one, even though there was no bargaining debate. Nobody thought it was a bad idea or concerning to do these tribal mobilization forces in Iraq the second time around. So there's different examples of how they kind of stick within the bureaucracy. I did also look at sort of exceptions to the rule. So at the same time you had all of these different programs going on, you also had some very different types of militias and forces being supported, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. So while you had all of these overt forces that had to do human rights training and have lay law vetting and all of those things, you also had paramilitary forces that were operating alongside special operations or CT forces who were engaging in operations that really didn't look at all like the laws of war, things like that. Didn't appear to have even the same restrictions in terms of force capacity or on weapons that some of the larger programs had, and continue to operate. And so I did also look at some of these larger ones. And if we have this overall trajectory of moving towards more controls, why are these exceptions there? Does it kind of undermine the overall argument that you're getting at? And what I conclude is that in some ways it actually points even more to the bargaining and organizational factors of why they might actually be leading to these. One is that because these forces tend to be so small and are sort of deployed in ways that don't capture either public attention or frankly congressional attention, they're much less likely to generate a bargaining debate. In many of these countries, even the Iraqi and Afghan governments weren't fully aware of them, so they also kind of get out of the way of having those objectors. And the second is that in a way, there are almost these organizational lenses also explain partly the different treatment of them. So they were treated as a different type of group than, say, some of the counterinsurgency forces. Skip forward, and we can talk about it more in questions if any of you are more curious about these folks. So what were the overall takeaways? I mean, I've mentioned a few of them just in terms of how much these different control mechanisms helped in getting these different programs authorized, not necessarily in actually controlling some of the risks related to them. And that's obviously a major concern. But I think one of the larger concerns that I looked at was how it maybe enabled riskier choices. So if you think about, take a step back and you think about you're going to authorize, a militia program, and everyone says, well, there's all these risks of backing non-state armed groups or rebels, but you think that you have a remedy to addressing the risk of human rights abuses or weapons diversion or whatever it is, doesn't make you that much more likely to authorize it. And what we see again and again is that control mechanisms had this enabling effect, that they enabled programs to be authorized that maybe otherwise wouldn't have been. And then often what they also did was in some ways acted as a bit of a blinder on policy decision-making. So maybe the best example of this is with the SDF forces in Northeast Syria, where, here a lot of the control mechanisms that were introduced were really to try to get Turkey to go along with the force. So Turkey considers the PKK to be sort of their arch enemy, although they've now resigned, but in any case, that's a very recent development. An absolutely existential threat, and there's nothing that's going to change their mind on this. But the U.S. nonetheless would try to use some of the same tactics they had used to prevail in Iraq and Afghanistan with their governments. They were like, don't worry, we're going to control all the weapons. They won't be used against you. We're going to do these thorough background checks. We're going to limit where they can do these operations. And absolutely nothing that they did in terms of these minor technical control mechanisms was going to change Turkey's position on this. But they were very persuasive within the halls of DC in thinking that we can sort of square this circle and make this completely unpalatable force be something. And so one of the costs coming out of the Syria conflict was the damage to the US-Turkish relationship over the support for these forces. And so in a way, it introduced a much more risky or dangerous consequence of it than simply something like weapons diversion. I am going to lightning to the head because I think I've used up my 35 minutes. So I will just say, in terms of what the relevance is for ongoing debates, still have a lot of these forces running around, not just in Syria, but also in other places. So a lot of the focus on these types of groups is still very much relevant. I also will say, although we will see what the Trump administration does with its approach to both some of these protocols and some of these proxies, some of the recent politics make me think that these ideas of examining transnational bargaining and thinking about how to understand foreign actors' influence on U.S. decision-making are more relevant than ever on a persistent to that. I will also just put out, in case anybody wants to pick it up in question and answer, that there's a lot of other stuff in the book about really trying to understand how some of these other unconventional players kind of get involved in U.S. decision-making and how that relates to everything from concepts of shared sovereignty in Iraq and Afghanistan to the role of sort of norm entrepreneurs and NGOs in kind of fixing some of these organizational SOPs. So with that, I will stop and move to questions. I think I've already taken way too much time, but thank you very much for the attention.
Took just as much time as was needed, so that was fantastic. Again, the rules of engagement, if starting with fellows, ask your question, but identify yourself and your topic of research. For people online, please put your questions using the Q&A function, and I'll go back and forth between people here and people online. So who would like to ask the first question? Todd, I have you first.
This was really thought-provoking. I guess so. Two questions. One is, I think the bureaucratic politics story is very compelling, but I was trying to sort of, in my mind, I guess, fix the key concern that all these agencies had when they're sort of trying to push for greater checks and balances. So is it that they want to increase the effectiveness and the overall efficacy of these militias so that they can meet their overall objectives in Afghanistan? They want to maybe defeat the Taliban, or is there also an aspect of this where they're looking to sort of indemnify or secure their own presence on the ground because the 2009 coincides with the surge in Afghanistan. So they're sending in 30,000 more troops, but they're also increased green on blue attacks and this concern that you might have people, locals turning on U.S. forces. So yeah, is it possible to disentangle between those two things, defeating the Taliban on the one hand, but also sort of protecting U.S. forces? And I guess relatedly, it just so happened that President Obama came into office arguing that Afghanistan was the war that needed greater resources and attention, and Iraq was the wrong war. But had that not happened, had he come into office thinking that Iraq needs more attention as well, would we have seen these sort of checks and controls come in around the same time rather than later?
Yeah. I mean, I think both are great questions. On the point about disentangling bureaucratic interests, interesting, because if you go back to kind of BPA theory, it will have this idea of, well, the mission kind of becomes the mandate. So organizations might be driven to address certain issues because they're within their mission sets, but they also become interested in certain issues because it's the thing that they do. They're hammers looking for nails and also looking out for their own budgetary interests. So at any given debate, you could see a range of them. This is where you stand depends on where you sit. So if you take the Afghanistan ALP debate, you had even fractures within agencies. So-called white SOF. So these are the ones that are specialist in counterinsurgents, as opposed to black SOF, which might be the ones doing the sort of night raid missions and things like that. So white SOF were kind of tired of being forced into that security position. We're like, we want to get back to the things we do. So they love the ALP. They were huge proponents of it. They really want this to go forward so they can get on to doing what they're doing best. DOD, Maine, has an interest that it needs manpower because Obama has authorized a surge, but told them they only have a year and a half for that surge to happen. So it wants these boots on the ground in however way that it can get them. It doesn't care if they're ideal counterinsurgents, but it just wants the boot power. The State Department, at least the embassy, it's the one that's been upheld with like trying to have state building work, trying to have an actual institutional control within the Afghan government. And so they are really concerned that this is going to undermine their ability to carry out their parts of their tasking. You can look in the Afghan government and actually see split reactions also based on their sort of parochial to institutional interest. And so you see that coming in across in each of them, and it's really hard to disentangle, and it shifts a little bit on each one. You get strange cases like the CIA support to the Syrian rebels, where you weirdly have the State Department and the CIA being advocates versus others, being more reticent, or, different splits with the Syrian Kurdish forces. So it just depends a little bit on each one, and some of it's personality based. On the difference between Obama, Trump, and whether you would have, Obama, and whether you would have seen more. So it's not that Obama was really interested in Afghanistan and therefore there were a lot of resources put in for controls. It's, in anything, it was almost that just because of the way that Obama had arranged his national security team around Afghanistan, there were a lot of competing views and actors. There were a lot of tensions just between Obama and DOD. And he fires McChrystal and then replaces them with Petraeus at the time. And then everything else that was going on in Afghanistan, you just had a more complex environment, and you had more stakeholders who had to be satisfied. You didn't have that. You had the much more unitary control in Iraq. So I don't know if you had the same thing where we're all behind the same strategy, and we think, McChrystal, whatever you need to do, you've got it. Never mind about these things. You could have had a scenario maybe where you would have had less controls in Afghanistan, or vice versa. You do then get control, so the second program in Iraq that I look at, which is the Tribal Mobilization Program, it does come in with having a lot of these checks and controls. But if anything, there are a lot of these sort of it's institutional controls. It's a redux from the Sahwa. It's not so much because of Obama's now just much more interested in Iraq again. And I thought the interesting thing also in looking at them, and I'll just also on the institutional, is that because these have to do so much with some of the other bargaining dynamics and also institutional kind of constellations, it's interesting to see that a lot of the more recent programs that were really heavily studied with controls, they came in under Trump. an administration that doesn't strike you as particularly attentive to things like human rights checks or lots of checks at all. And so you see that it has like much more to do sometimes than just like a decision.
Other fellows, or should I turn to faculty? Alan Weiner.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I'm Alan Weiner and I teach I'm Alan Weiner and I teach international law at the law school. And because you have a law degree and you disregarded Scott's bad advice,
Get a PhD and a law degree is great. So,
this is a question that is there any difference in the treatment of the two cases that you focused on, Afghanistan and Iraq, or and particularly with respect to Syria, based on the fact that the intervention in Syria, was presumably a violation of international law? It was an unlawful intervention, whereas our deployment in Afghanistan, with the consent of the government, supporting them in counterinsurgency, was not. Was that a factor at all in the congressional authorization? I mean, I know that when you look at the rationalization, the justification for support for, the SDF, public statements are very limited and very truncated. I think it seemed to me in part because the lawyers were saying like, guys, you shouldn't be saying too much about this.
Yeah. I mean, in one sense, there was a difference. If anything, it's because they were so hyper aware, especially the Obama administration, which is just manned with lawyers up to himself, that of the legal repercussions. And that's partly why I would say that you got so many controls, because there was just everything came under so much more scrutiny and debate, and they were so much more worried about every single step of it because of that overarching legal umbrella. That said, on the other hand, so the overt lethal assistance, which is what really would have tripped that violation, doesn't come in until after the ISIL expansion. And so at that point, the legal justification becomes not, in terms of overthrowing Assad, but self-defense is the legal justification that they sandwich it under. So in the U.S., State Department L's view, this was completely lawful. The part before, which was the CIA program, was of course covert, and so it had a different perception. But I would argue that even it was hyper attentive to some of these micro, like downstream legal concerns because of the overarching.
But do you think that, for instance, affected, like, you can fight ISIS, but not the Assad regime?
I think Congress just wanted to limit Obama's ability to escalate the situation, but I'm sure that also some State Department lawyers were more comfortable with that being the line that was drawn in terms of legal assistance. And you would also see that's why other countries, so it wasn't just the U.S., but also lots of other countries that were providing different types of support. And often their line drawing on what type of assistance they would provide, even what they considered lethal or non-lethal, was partly informed by their reticence of that legal line. Yeah.
I see a number of related questions online, and I wanted to ask two of them. One was you talked about vetting and background checks. Can you add more detail about what those were, and whether they mirrored the kinds of things that are background checks for the U.S.? So both of these questions are about our behavior with potential people we're hiring versus our behavior towards ourselves, right? So what about background checks and the like for recruitment? And similarly, you start with McChrystal and go through Petraeus. McChrystal was famous for arguing for courageous restraint, trying to encourage U.S. troops under the laws of armed conflict concept of precautions to accept some risks, potentially, to avoid killing non-combatants in collateral damage. Did that idea have any resonance in programs to encourage people that we're hiring in these programs to take precautions and to potentially take some risks to themselves?
Yeah, I mean, on the vetting and background checks, it depends a little bit on the programs, but some of it is similar. So one thing that runs across them is a lot of the human rights vetting background checks. So that there's, as I mentioned, there's a law called the Leahy Law that requires whenever U.S. state or Defense Department funding goes to forces of another state, so foreign security forces, if they be vetted. The department keeps a database where it collects any information it receives. And if there's assistance, let's say to Yemeni forces or Egyptian forces, they should be checked against this database. If there's derogatory information found, then the whole unit is blocked. That's a lot harder to do when you have non-state armed groups that you might not have any records on. So what they would try to do, for example, in Syria, is to try to actually build classify all the other that way law. So it just depends on how good the database is, though, in terms of whether it would actually be effective. So if you have a lot of these are Arabic language or Farsi, you have one mistransliterated letter, and you could have a completely wrong one. So there's a lot of reasons that it doesn't work, but that's basically the system. For the other ones, for kind of security vetting, they might just be looking for general background checks that have been flagged by, in some cases, it's U.S. security services, or they'd work with partners. Like they would also be vetted by the Iraqi security services or the Afghan at the same time.
And what about the courageous restraint question? That is, when the United States is trying to impose more constraints on the U.S., is that mirrored by imposing more constraints on others? Or conversely, you at one point put a slide saying sometimes we use this to take care of dirty work. That would suggest we're constraining ourselves, but not constraining others deliberately because of that.
Yeah.
Can you comment about that?
So, I mean, it really touches a chord with me, because what I was doing initially in Afghanistan when I hit on this question was working on civilian casualty reduction. So I had a lot of meetings with McChrystal and a lot of his staff members on changing certain tactics to try to reduce that. And the AOP did kind of get born in the same moment. And so it kind of, in that sense, you could be like, oh, it makes sense that it would have more of these restrictions. And they definitely wanted these to be kind of good counterinsurgents and not abuse the population. And that's how you shift them over from the Taliban. So it was sort of infused with the same moment of them in that particular example.
And what was the dirty work that we
So
wanted?
these are the sort of exceptions to the rule.
Yeah.
These were always there. They've been there since 2002 in Afghanistan up until the last forces, some of the guys we evacuated when we left in 2021. You always had this group that were sort of a carve out, that were working with sort of Black special operations forces or intelligence. At the same time as the ALP, they were known as counterterrorism pursuit teams. They later come under other names, 01, 02 forces. And they never had those restrictions placed on them. They didn't fall directly, in most cases, under the chain of command and under whatever standard operating procedures, courageous restraint restrictions were put in place for the rest of forces. And in many cases, they had very close working relationships, were on the same bases, co-located with U.S. forces. There were ample opportunities to basically instill those rules, and they didn't have it. So you would just assume that was a deliberate carve out.
And do you have a sense of how large these were? Was this thousands of people, or were these just some elite units that were deliberately not constrained?
They're pretty small. They're probably like hundreds, like attached to a particular small elite unit, as opposed to the ALP, which gets to be 30,000.
Right. Okay.
So yeah.
And Goldgar?
Yeah, hi, Jim, research affiliate here at CSAC. I think I have this right here.
But what do you work on, Jim?
I do work on U.S. foreign policy, especially NATO, U.S., NATO, Russia. Thank you for this fascinating talk. I was hoping to hear a little bit, if you could say something about learning, either within each case or across the cases or from previous instances. I mean, a lot of Cold War examples of U.S. proxy forces. There must have been lots of studies that the military did on this. I mean, it's sort of embedded, I guess, in your standard operating procedures. variable, that learning would be embedded in there, but I was just wondering if you could talk more explicitly about any learning that takes place, or maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. In some ways, of course, the U.S. has armed lots of militias throughout its history, especially during the Cold War. And in a way, you almost can see this trajectory as a little bit of a departure of that, in that a lot of the Cold War forces were almost all covert. They are associated a lot more with sort of death squads and sort of the outsourcing of the dirty war, that sort of thing. There aren't a lot of records of sort of standards of behavior. That was a lot of the critiques and the problems with them. And I think there's in a lot of these, a deliberate recognition of that, and saying, well, there's ways that you could, and this comes up with these counterinsurgency forces in particular, but there's ways that you could try to work with these forces and still have standards, notwithstanding some of the exceptions. So I think that some of the learning, I guess, from the Cold War period, they were deliberately trying to make a departure from them. Nonetheless, you do see some of those same protocols like resurfacing. So apparently, but not always having learned the lesson. So apparently in the 1980s, when the U.S. was supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets, it also briefly asked for ridiculous things, like for them to go and, collect the spent missile casing so they could keep weapons track. Same thing they would later ask Syrian rebels to do. And it's really, really hard to do that in war, and it's not really feasible. And they still demanded it again. So you do see some of this practice resurface without maybe like learning happening within it. So I think, and then learning from one to the other, I think the learning was in this sort of institutional absorption standard protocols, this idea that, but I'm not sure if the learning was, well, this really works in controlling these forces, or this really works in getting this program passed, and this is what we've deemed to be an appropriate way of mitigating risks, at least as far as sort of like a policy audience. And so I think those are kind of different learning questions. If you ask, for example, special operations forces who work with these type of forces all the time, they will say that all of these controls are not the way that you would actually control them, that it's sort of the classic, you can't just put someone in a 10-day training and then send them into a war zone and expect it to stick. You need to have actually an entire institutional structure and accountability system. And so they have their own learning that they have from years of military experience, but those are not always the same thing as these, which are really sort of bureaucratic manifestations of bargaining.
The gentleman in the black shirt.
Hi, ma'am. Thanks for this research. My name is Christian Reeves. I'm a student at the Masters of International Policy program. But in another life, I'm a Special Forces officer and managed 127 Echo in Iraq, as well as the counterterrorism program in Syria. So really, really appreciated your comments on this. My question was, did you find any differences in the control measures between CIA and DoD? Because one of my feelings, having managed and dealt with a lot of these sticky control measures that don't really apply to the programs that we're operating, was that the control measures were developed as a response to difficult lessons learned, particularly in Afghanistan, but also because of the nature of modern military deployments being like 6 months, and the principle not being defined, in that the principle in this relationship changes out every 6 months, doesn't have a lot of contact with the previous unit, and now must relearn their job every 6 months.
Yeah, in terms of differences between the DoD and CIA, I mean, definitely. So I would speak to Syrian fighters who had been through both programs, and they would know, they would be like, oh yeah, you have to have this one when you're doing the DoD program, and you have to have these factors when you're doing the CIA. They broadly were often looking for the same thing, but of course, the DoD one would also be bringing in their own protocols. So for example, there's, under US law, you can't provide support to related to child soldiers issues. And so that's very much built into DoD protocols, and it's something they might have a particular eye out for, that maybe the CIA is looking for different things in terms of the way it manages it. But then the operational issues can differ. Partly some of these bespoke programs, so they were all a little bit different. So what DoD was doing under its overt train and equip program in northern Syria, I think felt very different from the 127 Echo funds in Iraq. And you can even see even within those two, so there were also DoD train and equip programs that were supporting the Tribal Mobilization Force. but then you had a little bit of a different treatment for the ones that were under that funding. So it just depends a little bit in terms of which space they sat in. Were the, and so I'm trying to think of it in terms of your institutional question. I mean, the CIA program, obviously they wouldn't have that rotation, but they had sort of different issues to manage. So for managing the covert support to the Syria rebels, they were doing it jointly with a number of other Gulf states and also a couple of NATO allies. So they had sort of these operational headquarters in Turkey and in Jordan. And they, for Syrian forces to get funding, they'd sort of have to have the commander appear before these sort of murder boards. It would be like, the Saudis and the Qataris and the U.S. and the U.K. and whatever, and they would like pepper them with operational questions and sometimes like questions about misconduct or why they fired the rockets and hit this civilian group, and it's sort of to answer it. So it's sort of a weird animal in terms of how they actually controlled it alongside of other groups.
Ross, you had a question?
Ross Actor, management science in the School of Engineering. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about how we should deal with the current Syria.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to watch the current dynamics. I'm actually hoping to go back to Syria within this year to look a little bit more closely. I mean, I think everyone's watching to see if the U.S. will withdraw its support from Kurdish forces in the Northeast. Obviously, I think the U.S. would prefer, there's a lot of things attached to that, both in relation to continuing concerns about extremist groups in the region and the SDF being sort of the strongest way to contain that, not to mention it's sort of gap filling in terms of holding detention facilities. But if there have already been some challenges for the current Syrian, new transitional administration in terms of reaching for stability, in terms of managing the different parts of Syrian society, and notably the Kurdish autonomous region. So if the U.S. suddenly pulled out of that, I'm not sure, it may complicate things a little bit more, but I don't think anybody sees them staying in forever. And this administration already tried to pull support for the Kurds in the last Trump administration. So I'm not sure that they will keep it. But I think it's an interesting move that they've moved to lift sanctions, and certainly a different.
We're running out of time, so let me have Bailey ask the last question, and any of those who didn't get called on, feel free to stay a few minutes afterwards, and feel free to buy a copy of the book. That's the other thing. Bailey.
Thanks so much. This was awesome. I'm Bailey Ulbricht. I'm at the law school. I work with Alan Weiner. I had a question about how you think about defining the effectiveness or success of these organizations. I could imagine there being a lot of tension within these organizations themselves, as well as within American bureaucracy and bureaucratic politics. And I thought your example of a kind of control mechanism in Syria was really interesting, because it was about the limitations of who they could actually fight and what their goals were. And that, I'm sure, was really difficult to sell to a lot of the Syrian fighters that they were trying to convince to join this force. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about how you separate the effectiveness of the checks and balances from the effectiveness of what the group is trying to accomplish, and then like how you define the effectiveness of the group itself.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a tricky question. I think there are different ways to cut it in terms of whether I think the control is effective in what, in enabling this group to go forward, effective in limiting human rights abuses, effective in what. I mean, in the Syria support specifically, I mean, there's a much broader literature on concerns that the way that Syrian armed groups sort of had to cater to different outside interests in order to get funding created this overall sort of more fractured and competitive landscape that ultimately, didn't service a lot of the sort of more secular groups that were looking for revolution, as opposed to like the more Islamic groups. And there's, a large critique, I think, of particularly the U.S. management of some of those. I mean, that's a separate question from the controls, but it is like the concern out there is that how much were they actually hampering the effectiveness? In terms of these control mechanisms themselves, I think most people in Syria concluded that they were absolutely detrimental in terms of the effectiveness of the group, partly just because they slowed things down so much, whether you were talking about non-lethal assistance and getting, immediate defensive equipment in, or you were talking about, trying to get tow missiles. So like Syrian fighters would go and request support for a particular operation, and they'd get permission for it 4 months after the operation opportunity had passed, and it was half of the resources they would have needed to accomplish it. So just the sort of grinding bureaucracy didn't really work well within a fast-moving bureaucratic environment.
Please join me in thanking Erica Gaston.